Welcome to Plotfall. Tonight, we explore the grim realities of peasant life during the Black Death, and why survival was so improbable. Imagine a world draped in the suffocating cloak of fear. The year is 1347. The air, once vibrant with the promise of spring, now carries a chilling weight. Across the European landscape, a shadow is spreading, a relentless tide of sickness and death. This, my friends, is the dawn of the Black Death. Consider this. You are a peasant in a small, isolated village. Life is already a constant struggle against hunger and hardship. The sun rises, and you toil in the fields, your days dictated by the seasons, your survival tied to the unpredictable whims of nature. And so it was, generation after generation, a simple, brutal existence. But now, a new terror stalks the land. Whispers arrive from neighboring villages of a swift and merciless killer. People fall ill, their bodies racked with fever, their skin erupting in grotesque black boils. Death follows swiftly, an inescapable finality. The whispers turn to screams, the fear palpable, a thick fog of dread settling over everything. One can only piece together the fragmented narratives that have survived. The records tell us that these weren't isolated incidents. This was a plague of unprecedented scale. Your village, once a sanctuary of familiarity, now feels like a trap. The laughter of children is replaced by the cries of the sick and the mournful wails of those left behind. The familiar comfort of your home becomes a prison, each cough, each shiver, a chilling reminder of the invisible enemy at your doorstep. How would you react? How would you protect yourself and your family when the very air you breathe seems poisoned? The air hung heavy, thick, with the scent of wood smoke and fear. Meet Thomas, a man much like any other in his small village. His days began before the sun, his calloused hands already familiar with the cool, damp earth of his small plot of land. He was a simple man, his world defined by the rhythm of the seasons, the turning of the soil, and the love he held for his wife, Agnes, and their 2 young children. His life was a tapestry, woven with the threads of routine. The morning prayers whispered beneath the thatched roof, the midday meal shared with his family under the shade of an ancient oak, and the evenings spent mending tools by the flickering firelight. Thomas wasn't a man of letters or learning. The world outside his village existed only in whispered rumors and the occasional traveler's tale. His concerns were immediate and tangible, ensuring his crops thrived, protecting his family from the harsh winters, and maintaining the fragile harmony of his small community. He knew little of the vast world beyond, nor did he care to. His world was here, within the familiar embrace of his village. He found solace in the predictable cycle of his days, the comfort of familiar faces, the shared joys and sorrows that bound his community together. And so it was that this simple life, this quiet existence, became increasingly threatened. The rumors that had once been distant whispers now echoed through the village streets. Sickness, a strange and merciless affliction, was spreading like wildfire. One can only piece together the whispers that reached Thomas's ears. Talk of swollen buboes, of fevered dreams, of rapid and agonizing deaths. He dismissed them initially, clinging to the hope that these were just stories, exaggerated tales to frighten children. But then, the coughs began. First, a few isolated cases, then a steady crescendo that echoed through the village. The laughter of children, once a constant melody in the village square, was slowly replaced by a chilling silence. The familiar world that Thomas knew was beginning to unravel. The chilling silence that descended upon the village was a stark contrast to the usual symphony of hardship that defined Thomas's life. Life for a 14th century peasant like Thomas was a constant struggle against the elements, against hunger, against the very soil that yielded their meager sustenance. Dawn to dusk, his days were filled with backbreaking labor in the Lord's fields. Consider this. Under the feudal system, the peasant was tied to the land, obligated to work a significant portion of their time for the landowner, leaving precious little for their own crops and survival. And so it was, even in the best of times, that families like Thomas's teetered on the edge of starvation. The records tell us that a peasant's diet, primarily grains and vegetables, often lacked essential nutrients. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for special occasions or the Lord's table. This chronic malnutrition weakened their bodies, leaving them vulnerable to even the most common illnesses. A simple cold could become a life-threatening ordeal, a broken bone, a potential death sentence. Their homes, simple wattle and daub structures, offered little protection from the biting winter winds or the scorching summer sun. Hygiene was rudimentary, and access to any form of healthcare was virtually non-existent. The relentless cycle of labor, coupled with inadequate nourishment and harsh living conditions, had already taken its toll on the village. Children, their faces pale and thin, bore the marks of constant hunger. Adults, their bodies stooped and weathered before their time, moved with a weary resignation. They were survivors, hardened by a life of deprivation, yet even their resilience had limits. The whispers of the spreading sickness brought not only fear, but also a chilling sense of inevitability. How could bodies already so weakened possibly withstand another blow, another layer of suffering? The reality was a grim one. The very fabric of their existence, already stretched thin, was about to be torn apart. The whispers turned to hushed pronouncements. A farmer collapsed in his field, his body racked with unnatural chills despite the summer sun. A mother, tending her meager garden, succumbed to a relentless fever, her cries echoing through the close-knit homes. The records tell us these were the first, terrifying signs. A mysterious illness, unlike anything seen before, was weaving its way through the village. Consider this. You, weakened by a lifetime of near starvation, suddenly find yourself shivering uncontrollably. Your head pounds, your joints ache, buboes, grotesque swellings the size of oranges, emerge in your armpits and groin. This was the horrific reality of the bubonic plague. And so it was, in the stifling heat of summer, that the cold hand of death began to tighten its grip. One can only piece together the sheer terror that gripped the village. There were no doctors, no hospitals, only folk remedies passed down through generations, whispers of herbs and rituals that offered little solace against this unseen enemy. Each sunset brought a new wave of fear, each sunrise a grim tally of the fallen. The healthy began to avoid the sick. Families were torn apart by the necessity of survival. The bonds of community, once a source of strength, were now strained to the breaking point. How could one offer comfort when every touch could mean contagion? How could one maintain hope when all around, life itself seemed to be unraveling? The air grew thick with a morbid expectancy. The laughter of children, once a common sound, vanished, replaced by a chilling silence broken only by the moans of the afflicted. The pestilence had arrived, and it was here to stay. The pestilence had arrived, and it was here to stay. The waiting was over, replaced by a terror far more visceral than any anticipation. The first signs were subtle, a chilling unease, a creeping fatigue. Then, the fever. It ignited within, consuming the body with an unnatural heat. The world swam, distorted through feverish eyes. One can only piece together the fragmented memories of those who succumbed, accounts whispered in hushed tones, chronicled by those spared the plague's full wrath. The lymph nodes, the body's silent guardians, became battlegrounds. Swollen and agonizingly painful, they erupted into buboes, grotesque, purplish-black swellings, most commonly in the groin, armpits, and neck. These were the unmistakable marks of the Black Death, a brand that sealed one's fate. Imagine the terror, the burgeoning dread, as these buboes emerged, throbbing with a pain that defied description. There were no antibiotics, no understanding of the microscopic enemy waging war within. There was only the agonizing present and the bleak, inevitable future. The fever intensified, delirium taking hold. The body, ravaged from within, began to betray itself. Vomiting and diarrhea, relentless and debilitating, drained the life from its victims. Consider this. The very fluids meant to sustain life now became agents of its demise. Internal bleeding manifested as dark, purplish patches on the skin, a grim harbinger of the end. The stench of sickness permeated the air, a constant, suffocating reminder of the plague's relentless march. And so it was that the Black Death revealed its horrifying visage. Not a swift killer, but a torturer, meticulously dismantling the human body, shattering the mind and extinguishing hope long before the final breath. What must it have been like to face such an unknown, Such an agonizing end, with no knowledge of its cause, no effective treatment, and only the certainty of suffering. The symptoms were not merely physical, they were a manifestation of the terror of the unknown, a chilling testament to the plague's absolute power. The terror, however, was not confined to the individual. Imagine waking one morning to the sound of a choked cough from the next cottage, a cough that, just days prior, had claimed another family in the village. The fear, a chilling tendril, would wrap itself around your heart. The plague wasn't an abstract threat lurking in the shadows. It was next door. It was becoming real, immediate, inescapable. One can only piece together the rising panic from the fragmented records that remain. Whispers turning to urgent pronouncements, neighbor avoiding neighbor, the once familiar lanes of the village becoming pathways of fear. The communal well, once a place of lively exchange, now stood deserted, each family fearing the shared ladle, the shared water, the shared air. The bonds of community, so vital in these small rural settlements, began to fray under the immense strain of survival. Consider this: the faces of your neighbors, once etched with the familiarity of shared lives and hardships, now contorted by pain and fear. Children, usually vibrant with life, now listless, their laughter replaced by whimpers. The familiar smells of baking bread and wood smoke, supplanted by the cloying, sickly sweet odor of disease and death. The comforting rhythms of village life, the rooster's crow, the blacksmith's hammer, the chatter of women in the fields, all silenced by the oppressive weight of the plague. The spread wasn't a slow creep, but a relentless tide. Each day brought new cases, new deaths. The gravedigger, a once peripheral figure, became the busiest man in the village. His grim task, a constant, heart-wrenching reminder of the plague's insatiable hunger. Hope, like the bodies piling up in the hastily dug pits, was buried beneath the crushing weight of the Black Death. And you, trapped in this nightmare, could only watch as the world you knew crumbled around you. The chilling silence was broken only by the coughs racking Thomas's small cottage. His wife Agnes lay feverish, her breathing shallow and ragged. Just yesterday she'd been tending the garden, her laughter a bright spot in the encroaching darkness. Now her face was pale, marked by the telltale dark blotches that whispered of the plague's cruel touch. Little Anya, barely old enough to understand what was happening, whimpered beside her mother, her small hand reaching out to touch Agnes's burning forehead. And so it was. The plague had breached the walls of your closest friend's home. You, standing helpless in the doorway, felt a cold dread seep into your bones. What could you do? There were no doctors, no cures, only whispered prayers and desperate remedies passed down through generations, none of which offered any real hope. You'd heard stories of families abandoned, left to die alone in their homes. Could you bring yourself to leave Thomas and his family? Loyalty warred with the primal instinct for self-preservation. Consider this: your own family, your own children, relying on you for their safety. Could you risk bringing the plague into your home? The moral dilemma tore at you, a fresh wound in a heart already heavy with grief. One can only piece together the agonizing decisions made during those dark days. Decisions born out of fear and desperation. Thomas, his face etched with worry, looked at you with pleading eyes. He didn't need to speak. You both knew the unspoken question hanging in the air. He knew the risk you were taking, just by standing there. The cough from Agnes intensified, a chilling reminder of the invisible enemy that had invaded their home and, perhaps, already taken root in yours. The future, once a canvas of hopes and dreams, was now painted in shades of despair and uncertainty. The chilling cough echoing from Agnes's room wasn't just a symptom, it was a death knell in the ears of a medieval peasant. Because in the 14th century, the science we take for granted simply didn't exist. The very air you breathed, the water you drank, even the humors of your body, all were suspected culprits in the spread of this devastating plague. Imagine that terror, a world unseen yet omnipresent, wreaking havoc with neither rhyme nor reason. The physicians, those learned men of the time, clung to ancient theories. They spoke of imbalances in the four humors, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, as the root of all illness. Bloodletting, a practice dating back centuries, became the go-to treatment. Leeches, sharp knives, and even heated cups were employed to drain the bad blood, often weakening the patient further. One can only imagine the grim irony of this supposed cure hastening the very end it aimed to prevent. And so it was, with Agnes. Desperate to alleviate her suffering, Thomas likely sought the village barber surgeon, perhaps even a learned physician if one was within reach. They would have examined her, pronounced the imbalances, and proceeded with their gruesome remedies. They might have prescribed posies of flowers to ward off the pestilential air, or advocated for burning aromatic herbs to cleanse the home. Consider this. These treatments weren't chosen out of malice, but out of a genuine desire to heal. Yet their foundation lay not in scientific understanding, but in superstition and ancient texts. Utterly ineffective against the invisible enemy that was the Yersinia pestis bacterium. The records tell us of other, even more bizarre treatments. Drinking vinegar, swallowing crushed emeralds, even bathing in urine, all were attempted in a desperate bid to stave off the inevitable. These practices, born of fear and misinformation, offered only a cruel illusion of hope. Thomas, watching Agnes wither before his eyes, likely felt the crushing weight of his powerlessness. The future he had envisioned, the one filled with Agnes's laughter and warmth, was slipping away, swallowed by the plague's relentless advance. What could he cling to when even the learned men offered no real solace, no true cure? What could Thomas cling to? Certainly not the prevailing medical wisdom of the time. The learned men, the physicians, clung to the ancient theory of miasma. The air itself, they proclaimed, was the culprit. Foul-smelling vapors, emanating from rotting matter, stagnant water, or even the planets themselves were believed to carry the pestilence. Consider this. The very breath you take, the air that fills your lungs, was seen as the vector of death, and so it was that the responses to the plague often exacerbated its spread. Fires were lit in the streets, billowing smoke intended to purify the air. Perfumes and strong-smelling herbs were carried, pressed to noses in a desperate attempt to ward off the invisible poison. One can only piece together the fear that gripped these communities, a fear rooted in a profound misunderstanding. Imagine living in a world where the very air you needed to survive was believed to be killing you. This flawed understanding of disease transmission meant that true preventative measures like quarantine and sanitation were largely overlooked. Instead, efforts were focused on combating the phantom miasma. Doctors donned bird-like masks filled with sweet-smelling substances, believing these would filter out the pestilential air. They prescribed treatments that, in hindsight, seem almost comical, if not for the tragic context. The records tell us of physicians advising people to avoid bathing, fearing that opening the pores would make one more susceptible to the miasma. Can you imagine the stench, the filth, in a city already overwhelmed by death and decay? These practices, intended to protect, likely only served to further the spread of the true culprit. The Yersinia pestis bacterium, transmitted by the bite of infected fleas, carried on rats that thrived in the squalor. Thomas, lost in his grief and surrounded by this pervasive misinformation, had little hope of understanding the true nature of the plague that was stealing Agnes from him. His world, like so many others, was shrouded in a miasma of ignorance, far more deadly than any foul air. Thomas, desperate to save Agnes, clung to any flicker of hope offered by the learned men of his village. These were not uneducated men, but their knowledge, steeped in tradition and ancient texts, was tragically misdirected. Consider this. The prevailing medical understanding of the time viewed illness as an imbalance of the body's humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. And so it was, with Agnes burning with fever, that the barber surgeon, his hands more accustomed to shearing sheep than performing surgery, came to perform a bloodletting. The records tell us of the horrific practices employed. Leeches, fattened on the blood of the sick, were applied to Agnes's frail body. Their writhing forms a grotesque counterpoint to her weakening breaths. If leeches weren't available, the barber surgeon would make incisions, often deep and uncontrolled, further weakening the already ravaged body. Purging, another common practice, involved inducing vomiting and diarrhea, believed to expel the corrupted humors. Imagine Agnes, already dehydrated and weak, forced to endure this agonizing process. These cures, intended to bring balance, instead brought her closer to the brink. One can only piece together the horror Thomas must have felt, watching the woman he loved subjected to these barbaric treatments. He believed in the healers, trusted in their wisdom. How could he not? They represented the pinnacle of medical knowledge in his world. He clung to their pronouncements, their promises of a cure, even as Agnes grew weaker with each passing hour. The irony, lost on Thomas and his contemporaries, was that these treatments, far from being a cure, were likely hastening the inevitable. The open wounds from bloodletting, the weakened state from purging, these only served to make the body more susceptible to infection, a cruel twist in an already devastating narrative. What hope was there for Agnes, trapped in a world where the cure was often more deadly than the disease itself? Hope, a flickering candle in the howling wind, was soon extinguished. Agnes succumbed, joining the grim procession of souls claimed by the pestilence. For Thomas, the world narrowed to the confines of his grief. But the plague's insatiable hunger did not abate. The bell in the village church, once a comforting rhythm of daily life, now tolled incessantly, a morbid metronome marking the passage of lives. Each clang echoed the growing despair, a chilling reminder of the invisible enemy stalking the village streets. One can only piece together the devastating impact on the village from fragmented records and anecdotal accounts. The records tell us that in some villages, the death toll reached as high as 60 or 70%. Consider this: a bustling community, vibrant with life, reduced to a ghost of its former self in a matter of weeks. Fields lay fallow, untended as the hands that once worked them lay cold in hastily dug graves. The rhythmic sounds of the blacksmith's hammer, the cheerful chatter of children playing, these were replaced by a chilling silence, broken only by the cries of the bereaved. The sheer scale of the plague is almost incomprehensible to the modern mind. Entire families wiped out, generations lost. The social fabric, the very essence of village life, was unraveling thread by thread. Where once neighbors helped neighbors, now fear reigned supreme. Suspicion and mistrust festered, as the living wondered who among them would be next to succumb. The plague was not merely a physical affliction, it was a social and psychological one, dismantling the bonds of community and leaving a chilling void in its wake. And so it was, the plague relentlessly marched on, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. What would become of those left behind? Those who had witnessed such unimaginable loss? What would become of those left behind? Those who had witnessed such unimaginable loss? They faced not only the grim reaper's shadow, but the disintegration of everything they knew. The social order, once a source of comfort and predictability, crumbled under the weight of the plague. Fear, raw and visceral, became the dominant force. Imagine the terror. Your neighbor, vibrant just yesterday, now lies cold and still. The priest, who offered spiritual solace, now succumbs to the same grim fate. Who could you trust? Who could offer comfort? The very foundations of society, the church, the courts, the guilds, all strained under the immense pressure. One can only piece together the fragments of recorded history to understand the pervasive sense of despair. The records tell us of abandoned villages, fields left fallow, livestock wandering untended. The meticulous rhythms of rural life, planting, harvesting, trading, dissolved into chaos. Fear bred suspicion, and suspicion, in turn, bred violence. Whispers turned to accusations as people desperately searched for someone, something, to blame. The plague, indiscriminate in its devastation, stripped away the veneer of civility, revealing the primal instincts lurking beneath. Consider this: the bonds of family, once sacred and unbreakable, were tested beyond measure. Parents abandoned children, spouses deserted their dying partners, driven by the overwhelming instinct for self-preservation. It was a world turned upside down, a world where the most fundamental human connections frayed and snapped. The plague wasn't just a disease, it was a social earthquake, leaving behind a landscape scarred by fear, mistrust, and the abandonment of all that was once held dear. And so, the survivors, haunted by the ghosts of the departed and the horrors they had witnessed, were left to navigate a world irrevocably changed. The world, once vibrant and teeming with life, was now eerily silent, punctuated only by the mournful tolls of church bells, a constant, somber rhythm marking the passage of souls. The air, thick with the stench of decay, clung to everything, a grim reminder of the invisible enemy stalking the land. And then there were the pits, gaping raw earth, hastily dug and overflowing, a horrifying testament to the plague's relentless march. Imagine, if you will, the sheer scale of the devastation. Where once a bustling marketplace stood, now lay a mass grave, hastily dug, already brimming with the shrouded dead. The records tell us these weren't carefully prepared burials, marked with names and mourned by loved ones. These were desperate, frantic attempts to contain the sheer volume of corpses piling up in the streets, faster than they could be processed. One can only piece together the grim reality of those charged with this terrible task. The exhausted gravediggers, their faces pale and drawn, working day and night, the rhythmic thud of their shovels, a morbid counterpoint to the tolling bells. Consider this. These pits weren't small, secluded plots. They were vast, open wounds in the earth, swallowing entire communities. Descriptions from the time speak of pits so large, so deep, they resembled valleys, filled to the brim with the dead. The earth, once a symbol of life and sustenance, was now a gaping maw consuming its children. Children, parents, grandparents, lovers, all piled together, indistinguishable in the grim anonymity of death. The overflowing mass graves weren't just a practical necessity. They were a visceral symbol of the plague's indiscriminate and overwhelming power. They represented the utter breakdown of social order, the sheer scale of the tragedy that had befallen humanity. They served as a constant, unavoidable reminder that death, in its most brutal and impersonal form, was everywhere. And so it was, in the shadow of these overflowing pits, that the true horror of the Black Death became undeniably, terrifyingly clear. And so it was, in the chilling quiet that followed the initial onslaught, that the true psychological toll began to manifest. The ceaseless ringing of funeral bells had faded, replaced by an unnerving silence, broken only by the whispers of the few who remained. Imagine, if you can, living in a world suddenly emptied. Familiar faces gone. The laughter of children silenced. The bustling marketplace deserted. The vibrant tapestry of life reduced to frayed threads. The records tell us of widespread despair, a suffocating blanket of grief that settled over the survivors. This wasn't just the sadness of losing loved ones, though that was certainly profound. This was a deeper, existential dread. The world, once predictable and ordered, had become terrifyingly arbitrary. One could be healthy in the morning and dead by nightfall. What hope could flourish in such a landscape of uncertainty? Consider this. Every cough, every ache, every fleeting moment of weakness became a source of agonizing fear. Was this the beginning? Was the plague returning for them? The psychological strain was relentless, an invisible weight crushing the spirit. Trust eroded, not just in fellow humans, but in life itself. One can only piece together the fragmented narratives left behind to grasp the sheer scale of this psychological devastation. Chronicles speak of communities fractured by suspicion, of individuals retreating into isolation, driven mad by the constant fear of contagion. The plague wasn't just a physical affliction. It was a disease of the mind. It gnawed at the very fabric of human connection, leaving behind a landscape of fear, paranoia, and profound despair. The world had irrevocably changed, and for those who survived the initial onslaught, the true horror had just begun. The horror, however, wasn't confined to the physical suffering and the erosion of trust. Imagine a world without reliable information, where whispers and rumors spread like wildfire, amplified by the fear that permeated the very air. This was the reality for those grappling with the Black Death. The spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories added another, insidious layer of difficulty to an already unbearable situation. Consider this. In a time long before the instant communication we take for granted, news traveled slowly, distorted through countless retellings. The records tell us of outlandish theories that blamed the pestilence on everything from the alignment of the planets to the wrath of a vengeful god. Some pointed accusing fingers at minority groups, whispering of poisoned wells and deliberate contamination, fanning the flames of existing prejudices into raging infernos of violence. Others believed the plague was a punishment for societal sins, driving individuals to extreme acts of penance, desperate to appease a divine force they believed had turned against them. These weren't mere abstract beliefs. They had tangible, often devastating consequences. Fear-driven actions based on misinformation further isolated communities, hindered effective responses to the epidemic, and, tragically, often led to the persecution of innocent people. Imagine the terror of being accused of witchcraft, of spreading the plague intentionally, when in reality, you were just as terrified and vulnerable as everyone else. One can only piece together the fragmented stories of those wrongly accused, their lives cut short not by the plague itself, but by the fear and ignorance it fueled. The plague wasn't just a biological catastrophe. It was a social and psychological one, demonstrating the devastating power of misinformation in a time of crisis. And so it was, in the shadow of death, that the very bonds of community and reason began to unravel. And so it was, amidst the relentless march of death, that people turned to the only solace seemingly left to them, their faith. The plague, in its indiscriminate devastation, felt less like a natural phenomenon and more like the wrath of a vengeful God. Consider this: entire villages wiped out, families decimated, the very air thick with the stench of decay. What earthly explanation could suffice? Across Europe, sermons echoed with pronouncements of divine punishment. The plague, they preached, was a scourge sent to cleanse the world of sin. The records tell us of flagellant processions, men and women whipping themselves bloody in public squares, begging for God's mercy. They saw the pestilence as a direct consequence of humanity's wickedness, a divine retribution for their collective transgressions. This interpretation, while offering a semblance of explanation, also fostered a climate of fear and suspicion. Who were the sinners amongst them? Whose transgressions had brought this curse upon them all? This spiritual context shaped not only how people interpreted the plague, but also how they responded to it. Prayer vigils replaced social gatherings. Churches, once sanctuaries of hope, became overwhelmed with the sick and dying. Pilgrimages, undertaken in hopes of divine intervention, ironically became vectors for the disease, spreading the pestilence further afield. The very acts of faith intended to protect and heal often exacerbated the crisis. One can only imagine the despair of those who, having lost everything, found their pleas to God seemingly unanswered. Were they unworthy of salvation? Had they been abandoned by the very force they believed in? The plague, therefore, became more than a physical affliction. It was a profound spiritual crisis. It challenged the very foundations of faith, leaving many questioning the nature of God and the meaning of existence in a world consumed by suffering. The weight of divine judgment, real or perceived, added another layer of torment to an already unbearable reality. The Church, that steadfast beacon of hope in the medieval world, struggled under the immense weight of the Black Death. Imagine the priests, themselves terrified and vulnerable, yet tasked with providing solace to a flock ravaged by fear and grief. They offered prayers for the sick, performed last rites for the dying, and attempted to maintain some semblance of order in a world collapsing around them. The records tell us of tireless efforts to comfort the afflicted, to offer spiritual guidance in the face of unimaginable suffering. Church bells, normally a call to prayer or celebration, became a constant mournful toll, marking the relentless march of death. But the Church's power, even its spiritual authority, had its limits. Medieval medicine, intertwined with religious beliefs, offered little in the way of effective treatment. Prayers and penitence, while offering comfort to some, could not stop the spread of the pestilence. The concept of contagion, as we understand it today, was largely unknown. The miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through foul air, held sway. And so it was that alongside prayers and incense, priests often burned herbs and aromatic woods, hoping to cleanse the air of the deadly pestilence. The limitations of the Church's understanding became tragically clear as the plague relentlessly swept through communities. The faithful, seeking sanctuary within the very walls of the Church, often found themselves trapped with the disease, transforming places of worship into breeding grounds for infection. Consider this: the very act of seeking solace could inadvertently lead to one's demise. This contradiction must have further deepened the spiritual crisis. Was God truly present? Or had he turned his back on his creation? The immense pressure placed on the Church led to an outpouring of religious fervor. Some turned to extreme acts of penance, flagellating themselves in public, hoping to appease God's wrath. Others sought solace in apocalyptic prophecies, believing the plague to be a sign of the end times. The already tenuous social fabric began to fray even further. as fear and desperation fueled both religious zeal and social unrest. Where could the common person turn when even the church, that once unshakable pillar of society, seemed to crumble under the plague's relentless assault? Where could they turn? Not to the physicians of the time. The medical understanding of the 14th century was a fragile thing, a patchwork of ancient Greek theories, traditional herbal remedies, and astrological influences. Consider this. The dominant medical theory, Galenic medicine, believed illnesses arose from an imbalance of the four humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. The plague, with its terrifying array of symptoms, defied such simple explanations. Doctors, often trained more in philosophy than practical medicine, were utterly unprepared. The records tell us of their attempts, desperate and often misguided. Bleeding, a common treatment for almost every ailment, weakened patients already ravaged by the disease. Purgatives and emetics, designed to expel non-existent toxins, further dehydrated the afflicted. Physicians, clad in beaked masks filled with sweet-smelling herbs to ward off the bad air, could offer little real comfort or effective treatment. One can only piece together the fear and desperation of those seeking help, only to find the very institutions meant to heal them floundering in ignorance. And so it was that the plague exposed not only the fragility of human life, but also the limitations of the existing healthcare system. There was no centralized response, no organized effort to quarantine the sick or prevent the spread of the disease. Villages and towns were left to fend for themselves, often with disastrous results. The plague's relentless march exposed a chilling truth. When faced with a truly unprecedented medical crisis, the medieval world was woefully ill-equipped to cope. What hope remained for a peasant family watching their loved ones succumb, knowing that the learned men, the healers, were as lost and bewildered as they were? The plague didn't just take lives, it eroded trust, leaving in its wake a profound sense of helplessness and despair. The stench of sickness hung heavy in Thomas's small cottage. His wife, Agnes, lay feverish, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Their youngest, little Martha, shivered beside her, the telltale swellings beginning to appear on her neck. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through Thomas's grief. The plague, which had swept through their village like a vengeful god, had finally breached the walls of his home. He knew, deep down, that Agnes was likely lost. The records tell us that the bubonic plague, in its most virulent form, offered little chance of survival. But Martha was still fighting. And so it was, fueled by a desperate, primal love, that Thomas began his frantic efforts to save her. He had heard whispers of remedies, folk cures passed down through generations. He crushed garlic and herbs, creating a poultice to draw out the pestilence, praying to any saint who would listen that it would work. He bathed Martha's forehead with cool water, whispering stories of their life before, of spring festivals and harvest feasts, trying to keep the spark of life flickering in her eyes. One can only piece together the desperation of those moments from the fragmented chronicles of the time. There were no hospitals, no trained physicians within reach. Only a father's unwavering love against the relentless onslaught of the plague. Days blurred into nights. Thomas barely slept, tending to Martha constantly, his own exhaustion overshadowed by the fear of losing her. He foraged for scraps of food, leaving the cottage only when absolutely necessary, terrified of bringing back the infection that lurked in every shadow. He knew the risks. He knew the odds. But in the face of such unimaginable loss, giving up was simply not an option. What would become of Martha if he too succumbed? The thought spurred him onward, a testament to the enduring power of human resilience in the darkest of times. The fever raged within Martha, stealing the light from her eyes. Her breathing, once soft and even, now came in ragged gasps. Thomas watched, helpless, his heart a leaden weight in his chest. He bathed her brow with cool water, whispered words of comfort he barely believed himself, and prayed for a miracle he knew wouldn't come. One can only piece together the agony of such moments, the sheer helplessness in the face of inevitable loss. The plague, in its cruel indifference, didn't discriminate. It ravaged the young and the old, the rich and the poor, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. And in that small, isolated cottage, it was claiming another victim. Martha's hand, once strong and vibrant, now lay limp in his. He could feel the life draining from her, slowly but inexorably. Each shallow breath was a painful reminder of what he was about to lose. What would he do without her? The question echoed in the hollow chambers of his heart. The records tell us of the immense death toll, the millions lost to this merciless pestilence. But statistics can't capture the individual tragedies, the shattered lives, the silent screams of grief. Thomas held Martha close, her labored breaths growing weaker, fainter. He told her stories of their life together, their laughter echoing faintly in the desolate stillness of the cottage. He spoke of their dreams, now forever out of reach. And as the first rays of dawn painted the sky with a mournful hue, Martha took her last breath. The silence that followed was deafening. The world outside continued, oblivious to the immense tragedy that had unfolded within those four walls. And so it was. Thomas was left alone, a solitary figure amidst the ruins of his world, facing a future shrouded in uncertainty and grief. The plague had taken not only his beloved Martha, but also a piece of his soul. What remained was the chilling realization of his own vulnerability, a haunting premonition of the darkness that still lay ahead. The chilling silence in Thomas's home was a stark contrast to the growing chaos outside. The world, once familiar, was rapidly transforming into something unrecognizable. The plague's relentless march was not confined to individual homes. It was systematically dismantling the very fabric of society, leaving behind a trail of disruption and despair. Consider this. Even if Thomas escaped the plague's physical grasp, the ensuing collapse of basic resources posed a different kind of deadly threat. The vibrant marketplace, once teeming with life and commerce, now stood eerily deserted. The familiar calls of vendors hawking their wares were replaced by an unsettling quiet. The intricate web of trade that had sustained their village, the steady flow of goods and services, had been severed. The farmers, too, were succumbing to the disease, leaving fields untended and harvests rotting in the ground. Food, once a readily available comfort, was now becoming a precious and dwindling commodity. One can only piece together the desperation that gripped the survivors. The price of grain, the staple of their diet, skyrocketed. Hoarding became rampant, driven by fear and the instinct for self-preservation. Charity, once a cornerstone of their community, was eroded by the pervasive sense of scarcity. Thomas, grief-stricken and alone, now faced a new and formidable enemy, starvation. Imagine his plight, weakened by grief, facing a future with no food, no support, and no guarantee of survival. The plague had not only taken lives, it had stolen the means of living. The familiar rhythms of daily life, the planting, the harvesting, the communal sharing, were all but extinguished. The world Thomas knew was gone, replaced by a brutal struggle for survival against an invisible enemy and its devastating consequences. The records tell us this was a common experience. And as the days turned into weeks, the question wasn't just if Thomas would contract the plague, but whether he could even outlast the famine that was swiftly enveloping the land. And as famine tightened its grip, another insidious enemy emerged from the shadows: the breakdown of sanitation. The world Thomas knew, once governed by the rhythms of nature and the diligence of human hands, now lay in ruins. Fields lay fallow, untended. Villages, once bustling with life, were now eerily quiet, save for the occasional moans of the afflicted. The dead, too numerous for proper burial, were often left where they fell, or hastily interred in shallow graves. Consider this. In a world without modern sanitation, waste disposal was already a challenge. Now, with the social fabric unraveling, it became an insurmountable problem. The stench of decay permeated the air. Streams and wells, once sources of life, became contaminated with human waste and the fluids of the deceased. One can only piece together the horror of it. Even for those spared the plague's initial onslaught, clean water became a luxury, a memory of a world that no longer existed. Every sip was a gamble, a potential invitation to the very disease they so desperately tried to avoid. The concept of germ theory was centuries away. No one understood the invisible forces at play, the microscopic enemies that thrived in filth and spread with terrifying speed. The rudimentary understanding of hygiene they once possessed, the simple act of washing hands, the importance of clean water, were lost amidst the chaos and despair. The cycle perpetuated itself. Sickness bred filth, and filth bred more sickness. And so it was that the plague, a terrifying force on its own, became even more deadly, aided by the insidious creep of unsanitary conditions. The very environment that once sustained life now actively conspired against it. Thomas, like so many others, found himself trapped in a world where even the simplest acts of survival became fraught with peril. How could one hope to escape the plague when the very air they breathed, the very water they drank, was laced with death? The pervasive stench of sickness hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of the invisible enemy lurking within the cramped confines of the village. Imagine, if you will, homes crammed together, families huddled in small, poorly ventilated spaces. Privacy was a forgotten luxury. 10, sometimes 15 people sharing a single room, breathing the same stale air, sharing the same meager resources. Consider this. Every cough, every sneeze, every shared cup or bowl became a potential death sentence. The very act of seeking shelter, of finding comfort in the company of loved ones, became an act of immense risk. The plague, already a relentless predator, thrived in these conditions. Overcrowding wasn't merely an inconvenience, it was a catalyst, fanning the flames of the pestilence. One can only piece together the horror of watching a loved one succumb to the disease, knowing that the same fate likely awaited you, trapped within the same suffocating walls. Escape was not an option. Where could one go? Every village, every town, every city was gripped by the same fear, the same grim reality. And so it was that the simplest act of breathing became a gamble. The air, thick with the miasma of sickness, carried the plague's insidious touch. Every shared space, from the communal well to the cramped church, became a breeding ground for the disease. The records tell us that even fleeting contact could mean infection. Imagine the terror of knowing that a simple brush against a neighbor, a shared glance across a crowded room, could seal your fate. Thomas, like so many others, was trapped, not just by the plague itself, but by the very conditions that made survival almost impossible. The village, once a place of community and connection, had become a prison of pestilence, a waiting room for death. What fragile hope could possibly take root in such desolate soil? What fragile hope could possibly take root in such desolate soil? Thomas's story, tragically, wasn't confined to the confines of his village. This pestilence didn't discriminate between the thatched roof of a peasant's cottage and the stone walls of a lord's manor. But the impact on the peasantry, those tied to the land, was particularly devastating. Consider this. The very foundation of their existence, the agricultural cycle, began to crumble under the weight of death. Fields lay fallow, untended. The rhythmic cycle of planting, tending, and harvesting, a cycle as old as time itself, was broken. Those who would normally work the land, those whose hands brought forth the sustenance of life, were either sick, dying, or burying their dead. The crops withered, unharvested. Granaries, once brimming with the promise of survival through the winter, stood empty or dangerously low. And so it was that the plague's reach extended beyond the immediate sickness and death, sowing the seeds of a profound economic devastation. One can only piece together the sheer scale of the disruption through fragmented records and accounts. Entire villages were wiped out, leaving fields barren and livestock wandering untended. The feudal system, the very fabric of medieval society, began to unravel. The workforce, the very engine of the economy, had been decimated. The lords, dependent on the labor of their peasants, faced a grim reality: dwindling resources and no one to cultivate the land. The ripple effects were catastrophic. Food became scarce, prices soared. The delicate balance between supply and demand shattered. The plague, in its relentless march, hadn't just taken lives. It had decimated the means of producing life itself. And for the peasant, already living on the precipice of survival, this economic collapse was a second, insidious wave of devastation. A wave that threatened to drown those few who had managed to escape the initial onslaught of the disease. What would become of them, these survivors in a broken world? What would become of them, these survivors in a broken world? For the wealthy, the plague, while terrifying, was a hardship cushioned by resources. They could afford physicians, Rudimentary though their methods were, they could isolate themselves in their country estates, hoping to escape the pestilence that stalked the crowded cities. They could stockpile provisions, shielding themselves, at least for a while, from the creeping specter of starvation. But for the peasant had no such refuge. Consider this. Their very existence was tied to the land, to the communal fields now left fallow. Their meager savings, if they had any, dwindled rapidly as prices for basic necessities skyrocketed. Food became a luxury beyond their reach. Malnutrition weakened their bodies, making them even more susceptible to the disease's insidious grasp. One can only piece together the desperation of their situation. Imagine a family, perhaps a husband and wife who had already lost a child to the plague, now watching their remaining children grow weaker with each passing day. They had no access to the rudimentary medical knowledge of the time, no understanding of the disease's transmission. All they knew was death, all around them, relentless and indiscriminate, and the gnawing, constant hunger. The records tell us of widespread social unrest, fueled by this desperation. Rumors of price gouging and hoarding by the wealthy, whether true or not, fanned the flames of resentment. But even if they had been able to access resources, could they have afforded the inflated prices? The answer, tragically, is almost always no. The plague had exposed, with brutal clarity, the fragility of peasant life, a life lived on the very edge of survival, where even a small disruption could send them tumbling into the abyss. And the Black Death was no small disruption. And the abyss wasn't just physical, it was moral too. The plague presented agonizing ethical dilemmas, choices that tore at the very fabric of families and communities. Imagine, if you will, the creeping dread as your child, your spouse, your parent begins to show the first telltale signs. The buboes, the fever, the chilling certainty of what's to come. Do you stay? Do you risk your own life, and perhaps the lives of your other children, to care for the dying? Or do you flee? Do you abandon them to their fate, hoping to escape the invisible killer that stalks your home? One can only piece together the anguish of these decisions from fragmented accounts. Some chronicles speak of entire villages deserted, the sick left to die alone, their cries echoing in empty streets. Others whisper of unwavering devotion, of individuals who, knowing the risks, remained by the bedside of their loved ones, offering comfort in their final moments. There were no easy answers, no right or wrong choices in a world turned upside down. Every decision was a gamble, a desperate throw of the dice against a foe that seemed to hold all the cards. Consider this. The very concept of quarantine, so familiar to us now, was born out of this desperation. The practice of isolating the sick, of shuttering homes and even entire towns, was a crude but necessary attempt to contain the plague's relentless advance. But for those locked away, those left behind, what horrors did they endure? Separated from loved ones, surrounded by the dying, they faced not only the physical threat of the disease, but also the crushing weight of isolation and fear. The plague didn't just attack the body, it corroded the spirit, leaving behind a landscape of fear, suspicion, and unimaginable grief. And so it was, in the face of these unbearable choices, that the true cost of the Black Death began to reveal itself. Not just in the staggering loss of life, but in the unraveling of the very bonds that held communities together. The unraveling, as we've seen, extended far beyond the immediate effects of the pestilence. The Black Death didn't simply claim lives, it eroded societal structures, leaving a vacuum often filled with opportunistic darkness. Consider this. As entire families perished, their homes and meager possessions were left unguarded. In a world suddenly teeming with death, the lines between right and wrong, between necessity and greed blurred. The records tell us of widespread looting, not just by desperate souls searching for scraps to survive, but by those who saw the plague as a chance for personal gain. Imagine the scene: deserted streets, the silence punctuated by the cries of the sick and the opportunistic rummaging of thieves. One can only piece together the terror experienced by those too weak to defend themselves, clinging to life while watching their worldly goods disappear into the hands of strangers. And the violence didn't stop at theft. The breakdown of law and order, coupled with widespread panic, led to a surge in violent crime. Fear, as it so often does, bred suspicion and hostility. Neighbors turned on neighbors, fueled by ancient grudges and the desperate belief that someone, anyone, had to be blamed for the unfolding catastrophe. Accusations of witchcraft and poisoning ran rampant. Who could you trust when death lurked around every corner and the very fabric of society seemed to be disintegrating? So while you might have escaped the initial clutches of the plague, the threat of human cruelty loomed large. Would you be able to defend yourself against roving bands of thieves, against those driven to desperation by hunger and fear? Would you succumb to the paranoia and turn on those around you? Or would you cling to the last vestiges of human decency in a world gone mad? The Black Death presented a terrifying array of dangers, extending far beyond the disease itself, and survival depended not only on physical resilience, but on navigating a moral landscape warped by unprecedented loss and despair. The horrors of the Black Death weren't confined to a single, uniform experience. The plague, as we understand it today, manifested in several distinct forms, each carrying its own gruesome signature. The most common bubonic plague ravaged the lymphatic system. Imagine, if you will, the agony of swollen lymph nodes, the buboes, growing to the size of oranges in your groin, armpits, and neck. These throbbing masses, filled with pus and blood, were a visible mark of impending doom. The fever, the chills, the vomiting. Death, if it came, offered a grim release, often within a week. But the plague's cruelty didn't end there. Consider this. The same bacteria, Yersinia pestis, could also infect the lungs, giving rise to pneumonic plague. This airborne variant was even more terrifying. Highly contagious, spread by coughing and sneezing, it offered no outward signs like the buboes. Instead, a swift and brutal assault on the respiratory system unfolded. Victims struggled to breathe, their lungs filling with bloody fluid. Death, in these cases, could arrive within a mere 24 hours. And then there was septicemic plague. The records tell us this form attacked the blood itself. The bacteria multiplied rapidly within the bloodstream, overwhelming the body's defenses. Imagine the terror of knowing an unseen enemy was consuming you from within. There were no buboes, often no outward signs at all, save for the rapid onset of fever and chills, perhaps some dark purplish blotches on the skin as the blood vessels failed. Death, swift and merciless, could come before any symptoms even had a chance to fully manifest. One can only piece together the sheer panic this must have inspired. So even if you had somehow managed to evade the rats, the fleas, the coughs of the afflicted, another, even more insidious form of the plague might have been lying in wait. The Black Death offered no guarantees, no easy escape. The Black Death offered no guarantees, no easy escape. And the rats, those ubiquitous scavengers of the medieval world, were far more than just a disturbing presence. They were, unknowingly, agents of devastation. Consider this. The true architect of the pandemic wasn't the rat itself, but a far smaller creature, the flea. These tiny parasites, thriving in the rat's fur, harbored a deadly secret. Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for the plague. The transmission wasn't through bites alone, although that certainly played a role. The real danger lay within the flea's digestive system. When a flea infected with Yersinia pestis bit a human, it often regurgitated some of its previous meal, contaminated with the plague bacteria, back into the wound. This seemingly insignificant act was a death sentence for countless individuals. And the rats, teeming in the unsanitary conditions of medieval towns and villages, ensured the fleas had ample opportunity to spread the disease. Every dark corner, every overflowing refuse pile, every ship arriving in port, all were potential breeding grounds for this deadly partnership. Imagine the sheer number of these tiny assassins, moving unseen, carrying their lethal cargo from rat to rat, from rat to human. The records tell us that even within a single household, the plague could move with terrifying speed. One family member might fall ill, then another, and another, until the entire household was extinguished. And so it was across entire communities, leaving behind ghost towns and a landscape of grief. But the horror didn't end there. Even if you managed to avoid the bite of an infected flea, there was another, even more terrifying form of the plague lurking in the shadows, a form that traveled on the very breath of the dying. This airborne contagion, the pneumonic plague, transformed the dying into living plague bombs. Each cough, each gasp, each whispered prayer became a vector of death, spreading the disease through the very air itself. Imagine, if you will, the terror of such a scenario. You are a peasant, living in a cramped, poorly ventilated home. Your neighbor, mere feet away, succumbs to the coughing sickness. There are no masks, no understanding of germ theory, no concept of quarantine. What could you possibly do? One can only piece together the desperate measures people must have taken. Perhaps you hung herbs and charms in your doorway, hoping to ward off the evil spirits they believed carried the pestilence. Maybe you fled your village, only to carry the disease with you, unknowingly infecting others along the way. Or perhaps, paralyzed by fear, you simply stayed put, praying for deliverance that never came. Consider this. In the modern world, we understand the importance of isolating the sick. We have hospitals, protective equipment, and a vast scientific understanding of disease transmission. But in the 14th century, such concepts were utterly foreign. The very idea of quarantine, of separating the infected from the healthy, simply didn't exist. The sick were often cared for by loved ones, who in turn became infected. Families huddled together for comfort in their final moments, unwittingly accelerating the spread of the plague. And so it was that entire villages were wiped out, not just by the bite of a flea, but by the very air they breathed. The lack of any effective quarantine measures meant that once the plague took hold in a community, it spread like wildfire, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The terror of the Black Death wasn't just the agonizing symptoms, but the inescapable sense of doom, the knowledge that nowhere was truly safe. The terror, however, didn't confine itself to the hushed stillness of the countryside. It stormed through the bustling arteries of trade, crippling the lifeblood of the known world. The very networks that once connected communities, facilitating the exchange of goods and ideas, now became conduits of death. Consider this. The vibrant marketplaces, once teeming with merchants hawking their wares, fell eerily silent. Ships, laden with spices from the Orient and textiles from the East, arrived at ports only to find them deserted, their crews already succumbing to the pestilence. The impact on trade and commerce was devastating. The intricate web of global supply chains, painstakingly built over centuries, unraveled with astonishing speed. The flow of goods, from the everyday necessities like grain and salt, to the luxuries enjoyed by the wealthy, ground to a halt. One can only piece together the chaos that ensued. Imagine a world suddenly deprived of the essentials. A world where the familiar rhythms of daily life are shattered. Where once there was abundance, there was now scarcity. Where there was connection, there was now isolation. The death of merchants, sailors, and dock workers meant that goods could not be transported, even if they were produced. The fields might still yield their harvest, but without the means to bring it to market, it rotted where it lay. The records tell us of grain prices fluctuating wildly, soaring to unimaginable heights as supplies dwindled. The Black Death wasn't just a biological catastrophe. It was an economic earthquake, reshaping the very foundations of medieval society. The collapse of trade exacerbated the existing hardships, creating a vicious cycle of famine and disease that further decimated the population. And so it was that the world, already reeling from the plague itself, faced a new and insidious threat, the slow, agonizing starvation of its people. The once thriving centers of commerce became ghost towns, monuments to a world irrevocably changed. The world, once teeming with life, now echoed with an unsettling quiet. The bustling marketplaces, once vibrant with the shouts of merchants and the clatter of trade, stood eerily silent. The Black Death had not only claimed lives, but had irrevocably altered the landscape of society. Entire villages lay abandoned, fields left untended, a stark testament to the plague's devastating reach. Consider this. The very structure of medieval society, built upon a rigid hierarchy, began to crumble. The scarcity of labor, brought about by the sheer number of deaths, empowered the surviving peasantry. Those who had toiled tirelessly under the feudal system suddenly found themselves with a newfound leverage. Lords, desperate to cultivate their lands, were forced to offer higher wages and greater freedoms. One can only piece together the conversations held in hushed tones, the clandestine meetings where peasants, emboldened by their newfound power, dared to demand better treatment. The seeds of social unrest, sown by desperation and death, began to germinate. This demographic shift wasn't merely about numbers. It was about the very fabric of existence. The plague had shattered the existing social order. Where once a rigid hierarchy had defined every interaction, a new fluidity emerged. The lines between peasant and landowner, blurred by necessity, began to shift. The plague, in its cruel and indiscriminate destruction, had inadvertently paved the way for a reimagining of society. But this reimagining was far from peaceful. The struggle for resources and power, intensified by scarcity, fueled simmering tensions. The world, reshaped by death, was poised on the precipice of profound and lasting change. The echoes of the plague resonated not only in the empty villages and silent fields, but in the very heart of society itself. The echoes of the plague resonated deepest within Thomas. The fever, which had begun as a subtle unease, now raged through him like a wildfire. His body, once his reliable companion in the fields, had become a treacherous landscape of pain. Each breath was a labor, each movement an agony. He lay in the small, dimly lit cottage, his world shrunk to the straw pallet beneath him and the rough-hewn walls around him. The sounds of the village, once a comforting hum of daily life, were now distant whispers, lost in the roaring tide of his illness. Consider this. Thomas, like so many others, had no understanding of the invisible enemy that ravaged his body. The rudimentary medical knowledge of the time offered little solace, and even less in the way of effective treatment. Bloodletting, a common practice, likely weakened him further. The herbal remedies offered by the village healer, though given with genuine compassion, were powerless against the relentless advance of the plague. He was adrift in a sea of suffering, with no map and no compass to guide him. The buboes, once small and painful lumps, had now swollen to grotesque proportions, throbbing with a malevolent life of their own. The stench, a sickeningly sweet odor of decay, clung to him like a shroud. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he was nearing a critical juncture. The plague, in its cruel indifference, offered two paths: a slow, agonizing descent into death, or the slim chance of recovery, a path fraught with uncertainty and the lingering specter of lasting debilitation. One can only piece together the fragments of his experience, the whispers of fear and the desperate hope for a dawn that might never come. The records tell us that mortality rates were staggering. Would Thomas find the strength to fight, to cling to life in the face of such overwhelming odds? The answer, shrouded in the mists of time, lay just beyond the horizon. The horizon, however, offered little solace. Survival, even for those spared the bubo's touch, became a harrowing daily struggle. Consider this. The fields, once teeming with life, now lay fallow, abandoned by the dead or the dying. Who would tend the crops when the very act of leaving one's home could mean a brush with the pestilence? The familiar rhythm of sowing and reaping, the cycle that sustained life itself, was shattered. The stores of grain, once a promise of sustenance through the lean winter months, became objects of desperate competition. Fear, not generosity, ruled the day. Imagine the gnawing hunger, the constant dull ache in the belly, as families watched their dwindling supplies. And water, the very essence of life, presented its own perils. Wells, once communal sources of refreshment, became potential vectors of disease, each shared bucket a gamble with fate. Streams and rivers, too, held the threat of contamination, their waters potentially carrying the plague's insidious touch downstream. One can only piece together the desperation of those searching for sustenance. Were they driven to steal? To beg? To consume things they would never have considered? In ordinary times, the historical accounts offer glimpses, but the full extent of the struggle, the gnawing emptiness both physical and spiritual, is lost to the echoes of time. Did Thomas find food, clean water, or did the slow, agonizing grip of starvation compound the horrors of the plague around him? And so it was that the Black Death did not merely claim lives with its brutal efficiency, it eroded the very fabric of existence, turning the most basic acts of survival into a terrifying gamble. The search for food and water, once a simple part of daily life, became a testament to the plague's pervasive power, a constant reminder of the fragility of life in a world consumed by death. The struggle, relentless and unforgiving, awaited everyone. The relentless search for sustenance often led survivors to cross paths, fleeting moments of connection in a world ravaged by isolation. Imagine Thomas, weakened and weary, stumbling upon a small group huddled around a meager fire. Their faces, gaunt and etched with fear, mirrored his own. These weren't strangers in the traditional sense. The shared experience of unimaginable loss transcended the usual social barriers. They were fellow survivors, adrift in a sea of death, clinging to the wreckage of their former lives. One can only piece together the fragmented conversations that must have taken place. Whispered exchanges of news, if any could be called news, from deserted villages. Shared anxieties about loved ones lost or left behind. The quiet comfort of shared grief. A momentary reprieve from the crushing weight of solitude. Perhaps, for a brief time, the gnawing fear retreated, replaced by a flicker of hope kindled by human connection. A shared meal, however meager, offered a taste of normalcy, a reminder of the world before the plague's shadow fell. But these encounters, precious as they were, often proved ephemeral. The Black Death was a capricious predator. Today's companion could be tomorrow's victim. The bonds forged in shared adversity were constantly threatened by the ever-present specter of disease. Did Thomas find solace in these fleeting moments of camaraderie? Did he dare to hope for a future where such connections weren't overshadowed by death? Or did the constant fear of contagion outweigh the comfort of human contact, forcing survivors back into the isolating embrace of solitude? The records tell us little of the emotional toll of these encounters, leaving us to imagine the complex interplay of hope and fear that defined these brief moments of shared humanity. The struggle, however, continued. The struggle indeed continued. But not just against the pestilence itself. The Black Death forced upon its survivors a chilling calculus, a constant weighing of moral dilemmas against the stark reality of survival. Imagine Thomas, our hypothetical peasant, witnessing his neighbor collapse, racked with the telltale buboes. Does he risk his own life, and perhaps that of his family, to offer comfort? Or does he turn away, hardening his heart against the cries for help, prioritizing his own survival? Consider this. Resources were dwindling. Food became scarce as fields lay untended, and the specter of starvation loomed large. Sharing what little you had could mean condemning your own family to a slower, more agonizing death. One can only piece together the agonizing decisions that had to be made, choices that would haunt the survivors long after the pestilence had passed. Did Thomas steal food to feed his children, knowing he was robbing another family of their chance? Did he abandon his sick parents in their isolated cottage, believing it the only way to protect his younger siblings? These weren't abstract philosophical debates. They were visceral, life-or-death choices played out in countless homes across the ravaged landscape. The Black Death eroded not just physical bodies, but the very fabric of community, forcing individuals into impossible situations where every decision carried a heavy moral weight. And so it was that survival often came at a terrible cost, a cost measured not just in lives lost, but in the compromises made and the moral boundaries crossed in the desperate fight to live another day. The plague demanded more than just physical resilience. It demanded a sacrifice of the soul. What choices would you make, faced with such bleak alternatives? What choices would you make, faced with such bleak alternatives? Imagine, if you will, the pervasive, chilling fear that permeated every waking moment. The Black Death wasn't merely a physical affliction, it was a psychological siege. Every cough from a loved one, every rumor whispered in the marketplace, every new eruption of buboes on a neighbor's skin. These were not just symptoms of a disease, but harbingers of imminent doom. The very air seemed thick with the threat of infection. You couldn't escape it. Consider this. You share a cramped, poorly ventilated home with your family. One by one, they succumb to the pestilence. Their agonizing coughs, the delirium, the grotesque swellings. You witness it all, powerless to intervene. You know, with a certainty that chills you to the bone, that you are next. Where do you turn? Who do you trust? Every human contact becomes a potential death sentence. The records tell us of entire villages abandoned, their inhabitants fleeing in terror, desperate to outrun the invisible enemy. But where could they go? The plague was everywhere, a relentless predator stalking its prey. This constant threat of infection, this ever-present vulnerability, chipped away at the human spirit. It fostered suspicion and paranoia, turning neighbor against neighbor. Acts of kindness became rare, replaced by a desperate self-preservation. One can only piece together the emotional wreckage left in the plague's wake, the crushing weight of fear and uncertainty that bore down on every soul. Imagine that fear, that constant awareness of your own mortality hanging over you, day in, day out. And then ask yourself again, could you have survived? Could you have endured not just the physical horrors of the plague, but the psychological torment, the unrelenting fear that gnawed at your very being? And yet, amidst the suffocating despair flickered the most persistent of human traits: hope. Imagine you are that peasant, ravaged by fear, weakened by hunger, surrounded by death. Your world has shrunk to the confines of your village, your family decimated, the future a bleak empty canvas. But then, a whisper, a rumor. Word reaches your ears of a nearby village spared the worst of the plague. They have food. They have water. A fragile sanctuary, a sliver of light in the encroaching darkness. This glimmer of hope, however faint, becomes a lifeline. It fuels a desperate gamble. The journey is perilous. Roads are choked with the dying and the dead. The risk of infection is immense. Every cough, every fevered touch could be your last. But the alternative, staying put, waiting for the inevitable, is a slow, agonizing death sentence. Consider this: the strength it must have taken to embark on such a journey. The sheer will to survive that pushed people forward. Even as their bodies failed them, they carried with them not just the hope of physical sustenance, but the yearning for a return to normalcy, however improbable. The records tell us of these desperate migrations, these small pockets of resilience amidst the widespread devastation. And so it was in these desperate acts that a small measure of relief was sometimes found. Perhaps a shared meal, a safe place to rest, or simply the comfort of human companionship in a world turned upside down. These weren't grand victories, not by any stretch of the imagination. But they were victories nonetheless, small triumphs of the human spirit against unimaginable odds. They were the whispers of hope that kept the embers of humanity burning in the face of the plague's all-consuming fire. But was this hope enough? Could these fleeting moments of reprieve truly outweigh the overwhelming despair? That we shall explore next. Was this hope enough? Could these fleeting moments of reprieve truly outweigh the overwhelming despair? Perhaps not. Because even amidst these small victories, death was an omnipresent shadow. It lurked in the empty streets, clung to the air in the homes of the sick, and whispered in the coughs of the dying. For a peasant during the Black Death, the reality of mortality wasn't an abstract concept. It was a tangible, terrifying presence. Imagine walking through your village. Homes that once bustled with life now stood eerily silent, their doors marked with a cross, a grim symbol of the plague's passage. The records tell us that entire families were wiped out, leaving behind only empty houses and echoing silence. The air, thick with the stench of decay, carried the constant reminder of the plague's relentless march. One can only piece together the fragments of history, the whispers of lost lives, to grasp the sheer scale of the devastation. Consider this. In some regions, it's estimated that the Black Death claimed the lives of more than half the population. Entire villages were deserted, fields left untended, and the social fabric of life irrevocably torn. Every day you would witness more and more bodies piled onto carts, destined for mass graves outside the village walls. These weren't just statistics. These were your neighbors, your friends, perhaps even your family. The sheer volume of death became a horrifying spectacle, a constant reminder of your own vulnerability. And so it was. The plague didn't discriminate. It didn't care for your hopes, your dreams, or your small victories. It simply swept through communities, leaving a trail of devastation in its wake. The chilling reality for a peasant during the Black Death wasn't just the fear of contracting the disease, but the constant, suffocating awareness that death was everywhere. It was in the faces of the sick, the silence of the empty houses, and the ever-growing piles of corpses. How could one maintain even a flicker of hope in the face of such overwhelming loss? That is a question we must grapple with as we delve deeper into the heart of this dark chapter in human history. How could one maintain even a flicker of hope amidst such unrelenting despair? Imagine, if you will, the pervasive dread that seeped into every waking moment. The cries of the afflicted echoing through the village, a constant reminder of the invisible enemy stalking the living. You see your neighbor, robust and healthy just yesterday, now reduced to a shivering, feverish wreck. Then silence. The next morning, their door remains closed. You know what that means. The mental toll of this constant exposure to death was almost unbearable. One can only piece together the fragments of their experience from historical accounts, but the psychological scars must have run deep. Imagine the crushing weight of grief as families were decimated, children orphaned, entire communities wiped out. The world as they knew it, unraveling thread by thread. This wasn't a swift, merciful end. The Black Death lingered, a slow, agonizing spectacle unfolding before their eyes. And so it was that the relentless onslaught of death began to erode the very fabric of society. Trust between neighbors crumbled under the weight of fear and suspicion. Some retreated inwards, paralyzed by terror. Others, driven to the edge of sanity, succumbed to despair, abandoning all hope. The records tell us of communities ravaged not only by the plague itself, but by the ensuing social breakdown. Consider this. You are surrounded by death, but you inexplicably remain alive. Guilt gnaws at your conscience. Why you? Why not them? The pervasive atmosphere of death wasn't just a physical reality. It became a psychological prison. The constant fear, the grief, the guilt. A suffocating trifecta that trapped individuals in a cycle of despair. How did they cope? How did they find the strength to simply carry on? That's a question we'll explore further as we delve into the coping mechanisms and, surprisingly, the resilience of the human spirit during these darkest of times. The records tell us of widespread despair, a perfectly understandable response to the horrors of the Black Death. Imagine waking each morning to the cries of the bereaved, the stench of decay heavy in the air. The world as you knew it, gone. Your family, your friends, your neighbors, reduced to numbers in a grim tally. How could one not succumb to such overwhelming despair? And yet, amidst the pervasive gloom, flickered embers of hope, tiny flames of resilience. Consider this. Thomas, a hypothetical peasant farmer, has seen his entire family taken by the plague. His fields lie fallow, his livestock dead or dying. He is utterly alone. The temptation to simply give up, to lie down and wait for the inevitable, must have been immense. But Thomas doesn't. He perseveres. Why? Perhaps it was a deep-seated faith, a belief that even in the face of such unimaginable suffering, God had a plan. Maybe it was a stubborn refusal to let the plague win, a primal instinct to survive. Or perhaps it was simply the routine of daily life, the ingrained habit of tending to what little remained, a single surviving cow, a small patch of vegetables. The mundane tasks, the simple acts of living, becoming a lifeline in a sea of death. One can only piece together fragments of these individual struggles against despair. Formal records rarely capture the inner lives of ordinary people like Thomas. But in their resilience, in their refusal to surrender to the darkness, we see a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit. And so it was in these bleakest of times that the fight for survival wasn't just about avoiding the plague. It was about preserving hope itself, clinging to the belief that even after the darkest night, the sun must eventually rise. What drove this remarkable resilience? We'll examine some of the communal practices that helped sustain individuals like Thomas in the face of overwhelming loss. Some clung to faith, others to superstition. But amidst the despair, flickers of genuine medical progress, however accidental, began to emerge. Consider this. The very act of quarantine, born more from fear than understanding, proved remarkably effective. The records tell us that cities which swiftly isolated the infected, like Milan, fared comparatively better than those that hesitated. While they didn't understand the mechanics of contagion, they observed its chilling trajectory and acted accordingly. This, in itself, was a breakthrough, a primitive form of epidemiology emerging from the ashes of devastation. One can only piece together the fragments of knowledge available to them. Herbal remedies, often passed down through generations, were employed with varying degrees of success. While most were ineffective against the plague's relentless onslaught, some, like the application of certain oils and poultices, may have offered a modicum of relief from the agonizing symptoms. Perhaps more importantly, these practices provided a sense of agency, a crucial psychological bulwark against the prevailing sense of helplessness. Then there's the intriguing case of the plague doctors and their distinctive bird-like masks. Filled with fragrant herbs and spices, these masks were designed to ward off the bad air believed to be the source of the pestilence. Though their understanding of disease was flawed, their methods inadvertently offered some protection. The tightly woven garments and the masks themselves, however crude, acted as a rudimentary form of personal protective equipment, potentially limiting exposure to infected fleas. A cruel irony, a misguided theory leading to an accidental partial solution. But could these small, accidental discoveries truly offer a path to survival? The answer, as we'll see, is complex and heartbreaking. The fleeting hope offered by accidental protection was just that. Fleeting. Even if a peasant stumbled upon a practice that offered a sliver of protection against the Black Death, their chances of survival remained tragically slim. Consider this. Even if the herbs in a plague doctor's mask filtered out some particles, the true vector of the disease, the flea, remained a constant threat. These tiny creatures, carried by rats that infested homes and barns, were nearly impossible to eradicate. One can only piece together the desperation of those times, imagining families huddled in their homes, burning herbs and praying, while unseen carriers of death scurried just beneath the floorboards. But even more devastating was the complete lack of access to any real cure. The rudimentary medical knowledge of the time meant that even the wealthiest lords and ladies were essentially powerless against the plague's onslaught. For the peasant class, the situation was far more dire. Forget access to physicians. Most could barely afford enough food to survive, let alone the expensive and ultimately ineffective remedies peddled by traveling apothecaries. Imagine the fear and helplessness of watching a loved one succumb to the plague, knowing there was absolutely nothing you could do. No hospitals, no doctors, no real medicine. Only whispered prayers and folk remedies passed down through generations. And what of these cures? The records tell us of concoctions involving everything from crushed emeralds to arsenic and even human excrement. While some of these, like vinegar and certain herbs, might have offered a slight antiseptic benefit, most were utterly useless, and some actively harmful. The desperate search for a solution led people down dangerous paths, making them even more vulnerable. And so it was that for the vast majority of peasants, the plague was not just a disease, but a sentence. A grim reminder of their powerlessness in the face of an unseen enemy and the heartbreaking limitations of their world. The sentence, however, wasn't always immediate. The plague's insidious creep through a village offered a terrifying choice: stay or flee. Consider this: your home, your family, your entire life rooted in this small plot of land, now tainted by the specter of death. To abandon it felt like severing a limb, a betrayal of everything you knew. Yet, to remain meant facing an almost certain demise. The stories filtering in from neighboring villages were chilling whispers of deserted streets, piles of unburied bodies, and the omnipresent stench of decay. Staying offered a semblance of control, a chance to care for loved ones as they succumbed, to maintain some dignity in the face of oblivion. Perhaps, you reasoned, your family possessed some inherent resistance. Perhaps the plague would pass you by, a cruel phantom sparing your doorstep. This fragile hope, fueled by desperation, anchored many to their doomed homes, but fleeing, while terrifying, held the flicker of survival. It meant abandoning everything familiar, venturing into an unknown future fraught with danger. The roads were treacherous, filled with other desperate souls, resources scarce, and safe havens few and far between. One can only piece together the agonizing calculations that must have taken place in the minds of those facing this impossible decision. To flee meant risking starvation, exposure, and violence at the hands of those equally desperate for survival. It meant exposing oneself to the plague in other villages, becoming a potential carrier, a pariah. And yet, it offered the slimmest chance, the faintest glimmer of outrunning the invisible reaper. The decision to leave was a gamble, a desperate wager against fate itself. And for many, the terror of staying ultimately outweighed the perils of the road. And so it was. The roads became choked with the ghosts of the living. Those who had chosen flight over certain death in their plague-ridden villages now stumbled along dusty paths, their faces etched with fear and exhaustion. They carried their meager belongings, their worldly possessions reduced to what they could carry on their backs, a stark testament to the speed and ferocity with which the plague had unraveled their lives. The journey itself was a crucible. Food was scarce, and clean water even rarer. The weakened bodies of those fleeing, already compromised by hunger and fear, were easy prey to opportunistic thieves and brigands who roamed the countryside, preying on the desperate. Violence flickered like a guttering candle, a constant threat in the shadows. Consider this. Every encounter, every shared well, every huddled group seeking shelter, became a potential vector for the disease. Each cough, each shared piece of bread could carry the invisible seeds of death. Those fleeing the plague unwittingly became its carriers, spreading the pestilence further afield, seeding new outbreaks in towns and villages along their path. The very act of seeking safety became an act of perpetuation, a cruel irony of a disease that seemed determined to leave no corner of the world untouched. The records tell us of abandoned carts littering the roadsides, silent witnesses to the sudden deaths that overtook travelers mid-flight. Bodies lay unburied, a grim reminder of the plague's relentless march. The stench of death clung to the air, a constant, suffocating presence. For those who survived the journey's perils, reaching a new village was no guarantee of sanctuary. Fear and suspicion ran high. Newcomers were often met with hostility, driven away by villagers terrified of importing the plague into their communities. The desperate travelers, weakened and vulnerable, were often left to fend for themselves, their hopes of refuge dashed against the wall of fear. The road, once a symbol of escape, became a symbol of their isolation, a testament to the terrifying reality that in the face of the plague there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Imagine that weight settling upon you, day after relentless day. The plague wasn't merely a physical affliction. It was a siege on the mind. The constant fear, the omnipresent death, the sheer randomness of it all. These were burdens that crushed the human spirit. Consider this. Every cough, every fever, every ache became a potential death sentence. The psychological toll was immense. One can only piece together the mental landscape of the time through fragmented historical accounts. Chronicles speak of widespread despair, of communities unraveling under the strain of constant loss. Imagine the breakdown of social structures. Priests, once pillars of comfort and spiritual guidance, succumbed to the disease, leaving the faithful terrified and abandoned. The shared rituals of life, births, marriages, and deaths were warped into grotesque parodies of themselves, overshadowed by fear and hurried necessity. The very fabric of society was tearing apart. The records tell us of individuals driven to madness, of mass hysteria and irrational acts. Some embraced extreme religious fervor, believing they could appease God through self-flagellation and public displays of penance. Others descended into hedonistic abandon, engaging in reckless behavior, seizing what fleeting pleasures they could before the inevitable end. Can we truly judge them? Imagine living under the constant shadow of mortality, witnessing the collapse of everything you held dear. The psychological breakdown was not a weakness. It was a human response to unimaginable horror. And so it was that the Black Death didn't just decimate the population. It shattered the very foundations of medieval life. The survivors, scarred both physically and mentally, were left to grapple with a world irrevocably changed. They carried the weight of their experiences, a burden that would shape generations to come. What did they do to cope? How did they rebuild? That is a story for another time. But what of Thomas, our peasant farmer, toiling amidst this swirling vortex of death? He had, against all odds, evaded the plague's icy grip for weeks, burying neighbors, comforting the sick, and watching the familiar world around him crumble. He had meticulously followed the rudimentary preventative measures. vinegar washes, posies of herbs, and fervent prayers, yet fear gnawed at his spirit. One can only piece together his story from the fragmented accounts of the time. The records tell us the plague didn't discriminate. Wealth offered no true shield, piety, no divine immunity. It came for the rich and the poor, the devout and the cynical, with chilling impartiality. Then, the fever came for Thomas. A subtle ache in his bones, initially dismissed as fatigue from relentless labor, quickly escalated. The telltale buboes, dark and swollen, appeared in his groin. He knew. The cold dread that had haunted him for weeks finally solidified into terrifying certainty. The treatments, so faithfully applied, offered no respite. The herbs, the prayers, the vinegar, all useless against the plague's relentless advance. His family, already thinned by the disease, could only watch in helpless despair as the vibrant life within him began to dim. Consider this. Even if Thomas had survived the initial onslaught, the long-term effects could have been devastating. Chronic pain, neurological damage, societal ostracization, these were the cruel legacies the plague often left in its wake. For Thomas, however, there would be no grappling with the aftermath. His story ends not with resilience, but with a quiet surrender to an unseen enemy. He became another statistic, another nameless victim swallowed by the insatiable hunger of the Black Death. His unmarked grave, a simple mound of earth amidst countless others, served as a stark testament to the plague's indiscriminate power. The land, once tilled by his calloused hands, lay fallow, a mirror reflecting the emptiness that the plague had wrought. The land lay fallow, yes, but the plague's impact extended far beyond untended fields. Consider this. Even for those who survived the Black Death, life was irrevocably altered. The physical scars were often stark and enduring. Buboes, once swollen and throbbing with infection, could leave behind disfiguring lesions. Some survivors experienced chronic pain, lingering weakness, and impaired mobility, constant reminders of the disease's brutal touch. Their bodies, once familiar vessels, became landscapes of suffering. And what of the mental scars? One can only piece together the psychological toll through the fragmented historical accounts. Imagine living through a period where death was ubiquitous, where the stench of decay hung heavy in the air, where the cries of the afflicted echoed through the empty streets. The constant fear, the overwhelming grief, the sheer trauma of witnessing such widespread suffering, these were burdens that survivors carried long after the pestilence had retreated. The records tell us of communities fractured, of trust eroded, of a pervasive sense of anxiety that settled over the land like a shroud. Many survivors wrestled with guilt, questioning why they had been spared while loved ones perished. Others grappled with a profound sense of isolation, their social fabric torn apart by the plague's indiscriminate hand. The world, once a place of familiarity and routine, had become unpredictable and terrifying. The familiar rhythms of life, planting, harvesting, celebrating, were disrupted, replaced by a constant awareness of mortality. So while some may have physically recovered from the Black Death, the invisible wounds, the psychological scars, often lingered, shaping their lives and the lives of generations to come. The plague, even in its retreat, left an enduring mark on the human spirit, a testament to its devastating power. The survivors lived on, yes, but in a world forever darkened by the shadow of death. Yet, amidst the pervasive despair, amidst the skeletal landscapes dotted with abandoned homes and fallow fields, the human spirit, remarkably, endured. The records tell us of extraordinary resilience, stories whispered across generations, of those who faced the abyss and somehow found the strength to climb back. Consider this. Entire villages decimated, families torn apart, and yet, life, stubbornly, found a way. One can only piece together the fragments of their lives, the choices they made, driven by instinct and necessity. Imagine a young woman, barely out of her teens, having lost everyone she knew, taking up the plow, determined to sow the seeds for a new beginning. Or an elderly man, weathered and scarred, sharing his dwindling stores with orphaned children, offering them not just sustenance, but the comfort of human connection in a world stripped bare. These weren't grand, heroic acts, etched in stone monuments. These were the quiet acts of defiance, the whispers of hope in the deafening silence left by the plague. They adapted. They learned new skills, abandoned old ways, and forged new communities from the remnants of the old. They buried their dead, mourned their losses, and then, with aching hearts and calloused hands, began the arduous task of rebuilding. And so it was, in the wake of unimaginable devastation, that humanity revealed its remarkable capacity for resilience. The Black Death, a cataclysm that reshaped the world, also revealed the strength of the human spirit, a strength forged in the crucible of suffering, a strength that whispered, even in the face of death, that life, somehow, would find a way. But this resilience, this adaptation, came at a cost. The world they rebuilt was drastically different, the social fabric irrevocably altered. What would this new world look like? The world, re-emerging from the shadow of the Black Death, was a landscape transformed. The old order, once seemingly immutable, had crumbled. The sheer scale of mortality had shattered the rigid social hierarchies that had defined medieval life. Consider this. Where once land ownership equated to power, now vast tracts lay fallow, their owners claimed by the plague. This sudden abundance of land, coupled with a drastic shortage of labor, shifted the balance of power. Peasants, previously bound to the land by feudal obligations, found themselves with unprecedented leverage. They could demand higher wages, better working conditions, and even relocate to areas offering greater opportunity. The tremors of this societal shift echoed through the halls of power. The aristocracy, weakened and desperate to maintain control, resisted these changes, leading to widespread social unrest. Peasant revolts, fueled by newfound agency and the lingering trauma of the plague, erupted across Europe. One can only piece together the fear and desperation that gripped both peasant and lord alike. The old world, with its ingrained certainties, was gone. The new world, uncertain and volatile, was taking shape. The Black Death, while undeniably a tragedy of immense proportions, inadvertently spurred innovation and progress. The decimated workforce fueled a demand for labor-saving technologies. The records tell us this spurred advancements in agriculture and other industries, laying the groundwork for the technological revolution that would transform the world centuries later. Even the very structure of government began to evolve. The need for centralized administration to manage the crisis contributed to the growth of nation-states and the decline of feudalism. The world, reborn from the ashes of plague, was beginning its journey towards the modern era. The echoes of that dark time, however, continue to resonate, shaping the world we inhabit today, a stark reminder of humanity's fragility and enduring resilience. What would this new world, built on the bones of the old, eventually become? The world, scarred but not broken, began to learn from its ordeal. The Black Death, though a catastrophe of unimaginable scale, inadvertently propelled forward the very concept of public health. Before the plague, miasma theory, the belief that disease spread through bad air, reigned supreme. But the indiscriminate nature of the plague, affecting rich and poor alike regardless of their proximity to foul smells, began to chip away at this established belief. Consider this. Entire cities quarantined, the sick isolated, bodies burned en masse. These practices, born of desperation, were the crude precursors to modern quarantine and sanitation measures. While the underlying scientific understanding remained elusive, the effectiveness of these measures could not be denied. The seeds of future epidemiological practices were sown in the charnel houses of the 14th century. The records tell us of rudimentary forms of contact tracing implemented in some regions. Officials began to document the movement of people and goods, attempting to understand and control the spread of the pestilence. One can only piece together the fear and confusion that must have accompanied these early attempts at disease surveillance, a stark contrast to the sophisticated systems we rely on today. And so it was in the shadow of unimaginable loss that the foundations of modern public health were laid. The very notion of preventative measures, of intervening to stop the spread of disease rather than simply treating the afflicted, began to take root. The Black Death, a tragedy of immense proportions, inadvertently became a catalyst for change, a brutal but effective teacher. What lessons, gleaned from this era of death and despair, would shape the future of medicine and the very way we understand disease? The whispers of the Black Death, though centuries old, still echo in our modern world. We've journeyed through the squalor, the fear, the sheer, overwhelming scale of death that gripped medieval Europe, we've seen how easily a cough could become a death sentence, how entire communities could be wiped from the map in a matter of weeks. But the echoes of this tragedy resonate beyond mere historical recounting. They hold vital lessons, whispering warnings that we would be foolish to ignore. Consider this: the lack of sanitation, the rudimentary medical knowledge, the pervasive fear and misinformation. These were not merely features of the 14th century. They are vulnerabilities that persist in different forms today. In areas with limited access to healthcare, with inadequate sanitation infrastructure, the potential for widespread disease outbreaks remains a chilling reality. The speed with which the plague spread, facilitated by burgeoning trade routes, finds a parallel in our globally interconnected world. A novel virus, emerging in a remote village, can now reach a bustling metropolis within hours. One can only piece together the true horror of the Black Death by studying its details. By understanding the conditions that allowed it to flourish, by grappling with the devastating impact it had on individuals, families, and entire societies, we arm ourselves with the knowledge to prevent future catastrophes. The very foundations of public health, of quarantine, of disease surveillance, these were forged in the fires of that devastating pandemic. The Black Death serves as a stark reminder. Ignorance and inaction in the face of a contagious disease can have catastrophic consequences. The lessons learned, bought at such a terrible price, must inform our present and guide our future. By remembering the past, we can hope to protect ourselves from a similar fate. And so, the story of the Black Death becomes not just a tale of devastation, but a vital lesson in resilience, adaptation, and the enduring importance of knowledge in the face of an unseen enemy.